Hi, I'm Seamless, and a lot of you are probably confused right now because you're looking at a video that's titled Mastering, and yet you see a full-size picture of my camera as a thumbnail, denoting that it's going to be a video where I'm just going to talk about stuff and not actually use any appreciable demonstrations about anything to describe what I'm speaking about. And so why would I do that about mastering? Well, I've actually already done a video about my practical approach to mastering in the Production Basics playlist. If you've never seen that, I suggest you go check that out just to see. I'm going to mention some stuff that I definitely did talk about that video, but I did actually want to talk a bit more at large about mastering and the idea of mastering. So I'm not going to talk about like sort of the history of mastering, but I'm just going to talk about what mastering means to me. There's an idea of a pre-master, and then there's an idea of the master. The pre-master essentially just means what the audio signal that goes in before the overall master effects, which is to say the effects that are applied to everything. And then the master is the effects that you apply on the master, and the mastering is doing that kind of thing. So there's kind of a purpose between the pre-master and the master. Traditionally, as I wasn't going to talk about it, but I'm going to anyway. Traditionally, the pre-master is the idea that you want to make the song sound as finished as possible at that stage as you can without using master compression. And then the mastering stage is when you're trying to make that sound as loud as possible without damaging the vision of the song, which for different genres, different artists, and different songs means different things. So it's kind of hard to encapsulate all of that into a single kind of an idea. But when I think about my own tracks, my own mastering, I don't usually separate the two ideas. They're still there. There's still a pre-master and there's still a master, but I don't do them separately. When I have a track, I start working on a track, I try to master it as soon as possible. If you've ever seen a track from scratch stream, you'll know that I do this pretty early on. And the purpose, while that might not be the final actual master, it's still close enough that I know what all the stuff's going to sound like. I know that when I add new sounds or I make mixing changes with the mastering on, I can hear how it's going to react and how it's going to sound. And this is very important because with especially the harder, like heavier genres of EDM and some metal, how the kinds of pre-masters that react the best with the kind of mastering that we want are difficult to just arrive at on your own because they don't really sound like good pre-masters. They're weighted in a way that makes it react in a particular way with the master compression so that it sounds the way that we want it to sound with the texture and the crunchiness and the loudness and that kind of thing that we want out of these genres and our tracks in these genres. And that, I guess that's kind of hard to just sort of arrive at that. So when you do this, when you separate the processes, what ends up happening is that you make a pre-master and then you master and then you realize you have to change some things in the mix. So you go change things in the mix and you do that over and over and over again 12 or 13 times. And you eventually arrive at a pre-master that sounds an awful lot like what my pre-masters sound like when I just do them with the mastering on the whole time. A lot of people that are trying to be very technical about the whole -6 dB kind of style stuff, which is kind of like the umbrella term I use to describe all the do's and don'ts people tend to throw around about pre-masters and masters is... I totally forgot what I was talking about. Okay, something to do with the problem with at the same time. Oh yeah, well they'll say that you don't want to monitor the compressed mix because then it's kind of throws it off, and like that's fine except that like you listen to the final version of the compressed mix. So why wouldn't you want to do that? And there's some reasons about like listening fatigue and that kind of thing, but that's just loudness. Loudness and level are not necessarily related. So don't actually listen to it too loud is essentially what they're saying about that. And compression tends to make things louder. Generally speaking, when I approach mastering, that's what I'm keeping in mind is that I want the stuff to kind of behave that way so that like it sounds the way that I want them to, and no pre-master is ever going to sound like that is the thing. Depending on the genre, like if you're doing some of the lighter stuff, like chill step or something, I mean, even some chill step is still pretty hard in comparison to things that would actually sound good at a pre-master. Some things do sound good, but those tend to be things that are sparse enough with individual elements that are loud enough that the pre-masters are already pretty compressed. And for that to make any sense to you, you have to understand the purpose of compression. Compression, at its purest form, is the idea of controlling dynamic range. Dynamic range is the measurement between the highest peak and the lowest peak and the activity of a given signal, a song or a sound, that kind of thing. Compression reduces it or expands it if that's what you want to do. Although honestly, yeah. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that on my track, the R is silent, for example, there's not really a lot going on in that track. There's kicks, there's snares, there's some hats, and there's some basses. And the sidechaining is done as such that there's basically a perfect hole carved out that the kick fits into, so that when the kick and the snare are playing, nothing else competes with it, and then the bass plays. And then if I look at the pre-master, there's some level difference between the kick and the snare, but for the most part, the dynamic range is already very, very low. So when you listen to that, you can think to yourself, oh, but that already sounds pretty compressed. And you'd be right about that, but I'm not using literal compression. However, if we can say that the stated goal of compression is to control dynamic range, all the things that we do to increase our headroom, like equalizing, leveling things, side chaining, all of that stuff results in having more overhead by reducing the peaking and the variation in peaks. That's compression. That is compression. You have compressed your mix even if you never use a compressor. In fact, all a compressor is a really fast automatic volume envelope. That's all that is. And you could do that yourself if you really felt like it, if you had that kind of time on your hands. So like when people get all caught up in the idea of just using a compressor and not necessarily caught up in the concept of what actually is being compressed or needs to be compressed for that matter. Because like I said, in the song The R is Silent, there's, you know, the kicks and the snares, and they're all kind of on par with each other. And if you look at something just like a saw wave, just a saw wave is already, you know, just a single flat level there, which means it has a dynamic range of nothing. It's already compressed. You cannot compress it more. You can't even really expand it. It's because there's no difference in the peaks. You don't see a difference in the peaks until you start looking at the oscillation level. Even that is still a dynamic range of nothing until you get into wave shaping, and then you're artificially creating peaks, and that's not what I'm trying to talk about. So like the idea of not using compression before master is already just defunct because you are, but the idea of separating the masters and the pre-masters is a kind of a difficult thing, because all of these things, like what I just discussed, the side chaining, the leveling, that kind of stuff, all of that contributes to essentially mastering the thing so that you can make it as loud as you can without damaging stuff. And even so, even a little bit of damage sounds pretty good as well. A lot of these harder genres, like older school drum and bass, newer school drum and bass, metal, even, like the kind of bass music I like, that stuff's heavily damaged. There's distortion, there's all that, and like as far as like literally utilizing a compressor on the master to achieve that kind of stuff, go watch my production basics video. But like this is really more about the philosophy of mastering and that kind of thing. And do's and don'ts. Remember the video I put out right before this one, the last advice video, was about if it sounds good, it is good, and this definitely applies to mastering. And this applies to all the stuff anyone's ever told you about pre-masters too, about how like kicks need to be at -6, everything else needs to be at -4, and things need to be, you can't peak, they'll do all these things and you put them around like all these levels, and those suggestions have been around long enough that there's no way they're relevant to anything we're doing now. Because they were born from a time when technology didn't react the way it does, and with genres that aren't even a little bit as loud as the genres we are now. And then people start talking about the loudest war, about the stuff how like that's a sausage, there's no dynamic range. Turns out there actually is dynamic range, just in the spectral sense. Because if you were to isolate the lows and mids, the high mids, the highs, you would see that there actually is quite a bit of dynamic range still left in there, even though the resulting sum of the signal is still very sausagey. Not only that, but the genres they're designed to sound like that. They're designed like, you know, a Zomboid track wouldn't sound like it or even feel right if it had the dynamic range of, I don't even know what, old school house. Like it doesn't, that's just how the genre sounds. So trying to compare the values of something like, you know, the Beatles to Metallica isn't a fair comparison. That doesn't work. Comparing old Metallica to new Metallica is probably a fair comparison, and there's definitely a too far, but even that is up to you. It's up to you to decide that, oh my god, this sounds totally awesome, this awesomely crushed and whatever, and someone else going, oh man, I need to have more room or something. Like, that's totally up to you. There's no right or wrong, there's just what you want to do. That's all there is to that. That's all there's ever been. And that's sort of, I mean, that's my guiding principle when it comes to mastering. And I used to care, you know, about other people's opinions. And that was because that was more or less before I didn't know they were actually opinions. I thought they were learned facts. And for the most part, they're not. But boy, are they ever packaged as if they are. God damn the internet. Well, humans in general. It's not really an internet thing. Yeah. So I just kind of want to put all that in your head just so that next time someone asks me about mastering, I can just give them this video. But if you do have any questions about this, I suggest you watch the production basics video on mastering. I believe it's number 9. I believe there's a playlist call it production basics, where it goes over a whole bunch of other stuff too, including the basics of mixing, which is somewhat relevant to this. But the overall point of this is that, especially for the newer, more modern genres of music, the mixing and the mastering are inextricably linked to the overall final product, which you might be thinking, well, there. But, also, there's not a single difference between mastering a live, project's output in the same project versus rendering it out and doing it again on, a second thing. You could do that if you want, but, there's not a single bit of difference unless you use some, hyper specialized super DAW that's, only for mastering, which there are definitely some that do. I believe one's called Sequoia, and it does stuff and it analyzes things that I have never heard of, and I really can't say if it matters or not because I've never even tried. I've never seen it. I've not seen the results. It's just not a thing I know a lot about. One day I might care enough to go find out, but for the most part, I'm able to do what I want, with what I have. But yeah, anyway, check out that video. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.